Food companies make claims all the time about the health benefits of their products. They often cite scientific research to prove it. But in the flurry of claims and counterclaims, how reliable is any of it? Marion Nestle is Paulette Goddard Professor of Nutrition, Food Studies, and Public Health Emerita at New York University, and the author of several award-winning books. Her latest is Unsavory Truth, How Food Companies Skew the Science of What We Eat. And she joins us now for more. Hi. It's nice to see you again.
I'm glad to be here again.
You point out in the book that in the wake of World War II, food companies, including General Foods, Kraft, Nestle, which you're not related, they built their own research facilities. Why did they do that?
Well, they were interested in taking advantage of the new research that was coming out on vitamins. They were just being discovered. That was very exciting. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to make sure that they were developing products that met nutritional standards and that customers would like. And so they had all these research facilities with people studying food and developing new food products.
How different is nutrition research today from that?
Well, that changed in the 1980s when we had the shareholder value movement that required corporations to put shareholder value first.
So now they were trying to make a profit.
And make immediate higher returns on investment and pay off stockholders, and companies started cutting whatever costs they could possibly cut in order to reduce the cost so they didn't have to raise the prices of their foods.
What did they cut?
Well, they cut their research facilities. So there really are only two major food companies that are still doing anything like basic research. Nestle, no relation, and Unilever are really the two main ones that are conducting research. Danone is doing some too.
It's too bad you're not related, right?
It is too bad.
Free chocolate.
The black sheep of the family.
Well, near the beginning of the book, you note that financial ties with food companies are not necessarily corrupting. It is quite possible to do industry-funded research and retain independence and integrity. Why did you include this sentence only to spend the rest of the book discussing situations that disprove this notion?
Well, because it's true. It's true. In my own collection of industry-funded studies, about 90 to 95% of the collection have results that favor the sponsor's interest, but there's 5% that doesn't, 5 to 10%. That's not an accurate percentage. It's just a casual collection. Mm-hmm. But if you do studies, and there are people who have done this, of industry-funded research, say on sugar-sweetened beverages and whether they have any effect on obesity and type 2 diabetes, the industry-funded studies, almost all of them, will say no. Sugar-sweetened beverages have nothing to do with obesity and type 2 diabetes, but the independently funded studies, almost all of them, will say, well, yes, there's a big relationship.
But as a consumer, are you able to distinguish the difference?
Not unless you're paying close attention to who paid for the study. I think the issue of who paid for the study is one that everybody should be asking.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the book, you do tell this really interesting story. You actually ended up in a series of emails that were leaked when they were hacked from the Hillary Clinton campaign. Can you tell us about that?
Well, this was one of the most bizarre things I've ever experienced. When the hacking of Hillary Clinton's campaign emails came out, I got emails from two people who I didn't know, saying, Marion, you're in the emails. And I thought, what? I didn't have anything to do with Hillary Clinton's campaign. I couldn't imagine what I was doing there. But it turned out they had picked up a collection of emails from an advisor to Clinton who happened to be consulting for CocaCola at the same time. And her emails included a report on a talk that I had given in Sydney, Australia, when I was a visiting scholar there, taking notes on a talk I had given, very good notes actually, and passing them all the way up the chain of command with instructions that Coca-Cola ought to monitor my activities in Australia and also monitor the activities of the woman in whose group I was working.
I mean, I'm not you, but I'm like scared for you. Were you scared or
no,
like?
I was flattered. I thought, really? Coca-Cola sent someone to Sydney, Australia to pay attention to what I was saying about sugar-sweetened beverages. My book, Soda Politics, had just come out. This was early in 2016. And I assumed that there was someone from the sugary drink industry at every talk I gave. So I wasn't concerned that there was somebody at that talk. I was just astounded to find myself in hacked emails.
So with the email, I don't want to spend too much time on the emails, but...
And I should say that I have met in my office with the head of CocaCola North America 3 times. So we have a very cordial relationship. They're interested in what I have to say. I'm interested in what they have to say.
Well, you spent one chapter in the book talking specifically about Coca-Cola. How involved is Coca-Cola in nutrition research?
Well, it used to be much more involved than it is. And one of the reasons why I devoted a whole chapter to Coca-Cola was that after my book, Soda Politics, went to press, when it was far too late for me to write about any of this, there was a big expose in the New York Times about Coca-Cola's funding of the Global Energy Balance Network, a group of researchers who were arguing that physical activity is more important than diet in what you weigh. And this contrary to most research.
And this is called the International Study of Childhood Obesity, Lifestyle, and the Environment?
No, that was a separate issue. This was a study on the causes of childhood obesity funded by Coca-Cola at great expense. And that study, surprise, came out and said that physical activity, watching television, and not getting enough sleep were the major causes of childhood obesity, not what they ate.
What was the reaction?
Surprise?
What was the reaction by the public and the media over this study?
Well, the media raised its eyebrows. It was a study that was funded by Coca-Cola, clearly in Coca-Cola's interest. Very consistent with research that shows that industry-funded research comes out with results that favor the sponsor's interest.
Well, in the book, you do write that Coca-Cola has changed some of its practices since, but as a company, were they aware of the bias that their funding of nutrition research creates more than the recipients of the people who receive the money?
Well, it's hard to say. There are lots and lots of emails that have been obtained by reporters and apparently Russian hackers from Coca-Cola. And those emails demonstrate a quite close relationship between Coca-Cola executives and researchers who were funded by Coca-Cola. But it's difficult to say exactly how much influence the company had. But they didn't have to have any direct influence because the research from other industries, like the pharmaceutical drug industry, for example, is very clear that industry funding influence occurs at an unconscious level. The recipients of it don't think they're being influenced. They don't recognize the influence. They didn't intend to be influenced. It just happens.
Right. And in the book, let's talk more about that. In Unsavory Truth, you write, foods are not drugs. To ask whether one single food has special health benefits defies common sense. We do not eat just one food. We eat many different foods in combinations that differ from day to day. Varying our food intake takes care of nutrient needs. But when marketing imperatives are at work, sellers want research to claim that their products are superfoods, a nutritionally meaningless term. You write about pomegranates. You use that as a study in the book. Can you tell us about the pomegranates case?
Yes, the major sellers of pomegranate juice in the United States funded about $35 million worth of research to demonstrate that pomegranates were a superfood. And their definition of superfood was that pomegranates have antioxidants. I could have told them that. All fruits have antioxidants, but that the particular ones in pomegranates would save you from dying, would prevent heart attacks, would prevent diabetes, would prevent an enormous range of diseases. And they claimed that in advertising. The FDA took a dim view of that.
The Food and Drug
Administration in the United States, which regulates the kinds of claims that food companies can make about their products, and made the pomegranate people back off of a lot of that. And so those ads are no longer there, although I do have a copy of a reproduction of one of them in the book. But that was an example of a company that thought that if they could convince the public that pomegranates were really special, superfoods, that they would sell more pomegranate juice, never mind how much sugar it has.
And I think you mentioned that at one point, I guess in the States, that juice was selling for $8.99 compared to the next juice, which was selling for like $3.99
Oh,
or something.
it's extraordinarily expensive. They're making a lot of money off of it.
But people are buying that. So
Well,
what does that say?
Well, people believe that that pomegranate juice has special properties more than any other kind of fruit juice.
And something which you repeat a couple times in the book is you say that it's marketing, not science.
That's marketing, not science.
How can we tell the difference?
Well, as a consumer, you're up against, I would say, anything that defies common sense. You always want to use common sense when looking at nutrition issues. Nutrition research is extremely difficult to do because people eat diets of such extraordinary complexity, and you cannot lock people up in cages for 40 years and feed them defined diets and then see what happens to them. You can't do that. So you have to make inferences from other kinds of research, and that research is invariably flawed because you can't lock people up. So you want to think about whether the results of research make common sense or not. If they don't, you want to be skeptical. And my favorite is anything you thought you knew about nutrition is wrong. Every time I hear that, it's like this big red flag flies in the air. And you know that what they're saying can't be right because that's not how science works.
Well, another term that kind of gets on your nerves a little bit, it's in the section where you're talking about chocolate is NutriFluff. NutriFluff? What is that?
Well, NutriFluff is a term I invented to describe research on single nutrients or foods that defies common sense, with results that defy common sense. And the chocolate studies were Mars and other companies spent fortunes to try to demonstrate that dark chocolate is a health food, and almost everybody I know believes that dark chocolate is a health food.
I was disappointed to read that. I was
there you go. I'm so sorry. But in fact, you have to eat quite a lot of chocolate with all its calories and sugar in order to get the benefits of the flavanol antioxidants that are in unprocessed cocoa. And the processing of cocoa into most chocolate destroys the flavanols anyway. So it was hype. It was marketing hype. And even Mars has backed off of it and no longer is marketing, or says it's no longer marketing chocolate as a health food. Instead, it's now got cocoa flavanol supplements that it's trying to push on everyone. I'd rather eat chocolate.
Well, do you kind of think, too, that we believe what we want to believe? Because it just kind of, then we can do these things.
Well, I think there's something about the way the human brain is wired that if it's nutritious, it's good, and if a nutrient is good, we should get as much of it as we possibly can. And we just love the idea that products have special nutritional properties, even though if you stood back and thought about it for 20 seconds, you'd realize that it just didn't make sense at all. And of course, food companies know how to use these things to market to us. They are totally aware of the psychological research that demonstrates these connections. Most of us haven't studied those things.
Well, another study that you write about in the book is the fifth quarter fresh chocolate milk.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us about the story?
Yeah, well, that's probably the most egregious example that I use in the book. This was an ostensible study. It turned out it wasn't even a study, to demonstrate that high school football players who drank this chocolate milk product had fewer symptoms of concussions than high school football players who didn't drink this product. And the idea that all you had to do was to drink a chocolate milk in order to prevent the damage caused by concussions from playing football is astonishing to begin with. And as it happened, this study came out at a time when there was a lot of concern about high school football, the safety of high school
It came out
students.
around the same time as that movie Concussion
and a movie
came out.
Concussion, which demonstrated the
marketing.
the marketing and the hiding of the relationship of football to concussions, this is a really serious issue. And it turned out the investigator didn't really have a study, that Fifth Quarter Fresh, the company that made this product, had paid for all this stuff.
And this was done through a university,
This
right?
was done through the University of Maryland. It was a huge scandal. And the press got a hold of it when the study first came out. The press looked into it, asked for the data. There were no data. They were really upset about it. And I thought this was a perfect example of the extreme of food industry funded study, quote study, coming out with results that the funder wanted.
So the university ended up giving back the money.
Yes.
But because in the book you talk about how much, even for professors, for teachers, some of their salary comes from, you have to like raise funds for it. Even when you're doing the research, can universities do this kind of research without relying on big industry to give them the money?
Well, they can. Most money for research still comes from the government or from private foundations. And if universities are going to allow their faculty to take industry funding, I think they have to set up some firewalls. So the investigators are protected in some way from being beholden to the funder. This is very, very difficult to do. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the only thing that would work would be to tax companies and have them put all that money into a common fund.
No one likes taxes. How could you do that?
It'll never, it's politically impossible, but I think that may be the only thing that works. But I think it's important that universities set up criteria, at least set up criteria for accepting industry funding that include things like the funder can have nothing to do with the design, conduct, or interpretation of the research. The funder cannot interfere with the publication of the research in any way, and really the funder shouldn't even look at the publication until it appears in the press. I think you could set up a series of firewalls like that would be much more protective of the investigators.
Well, in the book, you write that, quote, dealing with the conflicts caused by food industry funding is best viewed as a three-step process: recognize, disclose, and manage. What would you say of those steps is the most important?
Well, I think we have to start with recognize. Because I know from talking to my colleagues that many of my colleagues who take money from food companies think it has no effect on their research. They think it has no effect on the research question, how they design that, how they conduct the study, how they interpret the study, or whether they can publish the study, and seem quite unaware of the way that influence occurs unconsciously and take no steps to try to protect themselves from unconscious influence. So I think recognizing that this is a problem is a necessary first step. Once you recognize that it's a problem, you can at least pay attention to all the various parts of the research process and try to make sure that your funder stays out of those steps.
But I think even as somebody who's doing this work, as a researcher, I think people might think that they're beyond reproach. So how do you get people to recognize that there is an issue if they don't know that there's an issue?
Well, that's why I wrote the book. That's what I hope the book would do. I hope that the book would encourage people, the general public, to be a little bit skeptical about industry-funded research, and I hope that it would encourage my colleagues to recognize that this is something that they need to deal with.
But you also write that disclosing financial conflicts of interest can actually backfire.
Yes.
In what ways?
Well, disclosure, and nearly all professional journals now require investigators to say who paid for their research and do they have any ties to the funder as a consultant, as through any other way that they could possibly have a financial relationship with the funder. They're required to say that in their papers. And there have been studies that have examined how that works in practice, particularly with pharmaceutical companies giving money to physicians, something that we know a great deal about because the United States government requires drug companies to disclose how much money they give to physicians and who specifically they give it to, so you can do studies of it. And these studies show that if you ask patients whether their physician has disclosed drug industry funding or not, the patients trust the physician more if the physician has disclosed it. That's perverse.
Well, you mentioned tax, and we kind of joked about it, but in the book you write on the issue of government funding for research. Government agencies ought to be funding basic research in general and nutrition, food, and agriculture research in particular. We need to know how best to feed the world's growing population sustainably and in ways that promote the health of people and the planet. Food companies' priorities preclude their investment in such questions, except when research might lead to product development and increased sales. As citizens, we have the right to demand that government agencies dealing with food and nutrition matters put public health first. How optimistic are you that this can be achieved in a time when the word tax sends like people are like, no.
No, well, I think awareness of this as an issue is very important. And we know that Coca-Cola's awareness of the embarrassment that it suffered as a result of various disclosures in the New York Times about Coca-Cola's funding has changed the way that it funds research, is looking much more carefully at the kind of research that it funds, is dealing with it in a much more transparent way. That's a big change, and one that I applaud. Whether their current method is going to make any difference, we don't know yet, but it's something we can find out. I think other companies should take a look at that, too.
Well, I mean, in the book you write about Mars and obviously Coca-Cola. Companies, when this news breaks, is it more about their reputation or is it about them actually realizing that this is something that they shouldn't have done in the first place, or changing behaviors?
Well, I think it's important to understand that food companies are not social service or public health agencies. That's not their, I mean, they make products that we love, but that's not their job. Their job is to make as much profit as they possibly can in order to give their stockholders the highest possible returns on their investment. That's their number one priority. So to expect food companies to behave as social service or public health agencies is unrealistic.
I feel like I'm beating up on Coca-Cola, but you did spend a chapter in the book talking about it. They've changed the way they do things in North America, but what are they doing in China?
Well, a few months ago, there was an expose. There were articles written in the British Medical Journal and in the Journal of Public Health Policy that documented Coca-Cola's working through an organization called the International Life Sciences Institute, which pretends to be an independent think tank on food science issues, but is actually funded by the food industry. And it showed how Coca-Cola, working through this organization, got the Chinese government to emphasize physical activity as a means to deal with its obesity problem, rather than telling the public they should drink fewer sodas.
So have they not learned anything?
The companies are, if they can, they may have to behave better in the United States, but if they can't sell it in the United States, they're going to try to sell it overseas. I would repeat, they're not social service agencies.
Are sugar taxes maybe a possibility, or are they a good thing?
Well, there are countries that are looking at sugar taxes, and that will have a big effect on soft drink manufacturers.
On your, you have a site called Food Politics.
Foodpolitics.com.
And you write about the industry-funded study of the week. Why do you do that?
Well, the book came out a couple of months ago, but as a result of that, people are sending me these absolutely delicious examples of industry-funded studies with hilarious results. I think they're funny.
And an example?
They're totally predictable. Well, for some reason or other, I love the mango study. And this was a study where it said that mangoes are better than fiber supplements for preventing constipation. I looked at the title of the study and I thought, who funded that? Bingo, the National Mango Board.
Well, this is the thing that I found in, that was really surprising in the book, that avocado companies do studies, mango. It's not just like Coca-Cola or Mars, like processed foods, but natural food, they also do studies, which is wild to me.
Well, they want you to buy more of their products. Everybody is competing with everybody else. As I like to explain, there are 4,000 calories available per day in the United States for every man, woman, and little tiny baby, and we need on average about 2,000. That makes the food industry hugely competitive. So every producer of a food is competing with every other producer of a food for your food dollar. And they think that if they can convince you that mangoes have special properties, somebody who wouldn't think of buying mangoes because they're delicious and doesn't want to peel them would say, okay, I'm going to eat mangoes because it'll solve my constipation problem. And yes, I'm going to eat avocados because it'll solve my heart disease problem or something else. Anytime you see one food being responsible for preventing a particular disease.
That's a red flag?
That's a red flag because we don't eat single foods. We eat very complicated diets. I'm all for eating mangoes. I'm all for eating avocados. I'm all for eating nuts. I love all of those foods. You should eat a little bit of all of them.
And some chocolate.
And absolutely chocolate.
What is your hope for the future of nutrition research?
Well, I hope that people will recognize that they have to be very careful about conflicts of interest, and that also we will figure out ways to do nutrition research in ways that meet more rigorous scientific standards, as well as more rigorous ethical standards. I think the ethical standards are easier to deal with than the scientific ones because it's so hard to do nutrition research in any kind of compelling way. So I want to see lots more effort into dealing with the ethical issues.
Well,
and the science will follow.
Marion, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for writing the book. I think it's going to allow consumers to make more empowered and better choices.
I certainly hope so.
Thanks.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.